Now then, Neville, stop being a train, dear, and come and sit down. Well, get into the station and then sit down. George, don't do that.
She had great style in everything she did. And that was a big influence on someone as raw as me.
Oh, well, what do television viewers want to know about one? Likes and dislikes. Yes, I've got plenty of them. Well, now, which do I like best, men or women? I think it rather depends what for.
Yeah, I think, was it Celia Johnson who said about Joyce that she felt it was absurd that one woman should have so many talents?
I go jazzy when I hear the beat, in an old world way, maybe. A middle-aged matron, as you can see, in a middle-aged hat on her way to tea. But inside all hell is breaking loose in me. I go jazzy when I hear the beat.
Joyce had this great knack of appearing to be cheerful on and off the screen.
Oh, I couldn't do without my telly. Well, somebody give it me. I think it was the government. Could have been the Red Cross. It was that type of thing. But it's got this bad habit, you know. The pictures go like that. And you have to hit it.
I knew very little about her except that she'd played those parts in the Centrinians, and that I always wanted to do what she did, you know, those sort of over-extenuated ladies, you know.
When we think of Joyce Grenfel, dozens of different characters come to mind. They're often funny, sometimes sad or absurd, occasionally pretentious or awkward.
Oh, you recognised me.
The fact is that Joyce Grenfel was equally at home playing an American aristocrat or a working-class tenant in a council high-rise. But whatever the role she assumed, Joyce was adored by audiences around the world who saw something of people they knew in her performances. To some of them, she was a gifted amateur with the guts and the talent to go out and perform. But in reality, Joyce was very far from being an amateur. In contrast to her easy stage manner, she was a determined and focused performer. And at a time when women of Joyce's background were not expected to make their own way in the world, she was something of a pioneer with a very keen sense of her own talent. So who was Joyce Grenfel, and what was she really like?
Hand me down my bonnet and hand me down my shawl.
Joyce Grenfel was half American. Her mother came from a distinguished Virginian family, the Langhorns. Nora Langhorne was the youngest of 7 children, of whom Nancy, her older sister, married into the Astor family and became the first woman MP to sit in the British Parliament. By contrast, Nora married modestly, at least by the standards of her illustrious sister, settling for an English architect with only limited prospects. Nevertheless, Joyce and her younger brother Tommy were raised in Knightsbridge in a manner befitting the children of a wealthy Virginian family. Consequently, her early years were dominated more by her nanny than by her mother. Before she had reached her teens, Joyce suffered the first of several setbacks that would shape her personality and her subsequent career.
Nanny Lucy was the anchor for her childhood. She was always there. She picked her up from school. She took her to piano lessons. She took her to the dentist. She did all the things that a modern parent would do, but in those days a nanny did. And Joyce's parents decided that Nanny Lucy should leave the day that Joyce's period started. Unfortunately, they didn't tell Joyce this. They didn't tell her much about periods either. So when she was about 12, the inevitable happened. Nanny showed her what to do. Joyce went off to school. When she came back, Nanny had gone. No saying goodbye. Everybody decided clean break, much easier. And the light went out of Joyce's life. And I think it was from that time that she became a bit of a sort of prig, quite sort of prudy, and everything had to be just so.
Joyce grew up under the watchful eye of her mother's sister, Nancy Astor, and spent her formative years on the fringes of aristocratic life, enjoying the dazzling house parties at the Astors' Buckinghamshire home, Cliveden. Here she is, aged 15, in some home movie footage shot by her uncle, Waldorf Astor, in 1925.
We were rather fascinated by my sister and I, because we were 11 and 12, and she was something quite new. And she was quite a breath of fresh air in our family. She came into it from quite a different angle, which we put down to her being partly American. But she was into jazz, and she played the piano, and she went to nightclubs, and she lived what I think was called a flippity-gibbety sort of life, which we thought was splendid, and rather different to our parents' sort of life, who were really reconstructing their lives after the First World War, rather.
Many years later, Joyce recalled those early happy years as a teenager among the smart set.
Aunt Nancy's parties were always tremendously mixed. I mean, she was a great mixer of people. In fact, she didn't do the mixing, actually, because people really never got introduced at Cliveden. It was one of the features of life here. And I've often seen rather bewildered American visitors who would be standing around in the hall, and they'd come up and they'd say, I'm Mrs. Magruder, and this is Dr. Magruder, and Lady Astor's very kindly invited us to come down for the weekend. And then, you know, you'd explain that you were a niece, and it would all work out all right. But it was this extraordinary mixture of people. And you know, people weren't always very well identified. We always had a kind of family joke that it would be absolutely possible for someone to come and stay from Friday till Monday without anyone really finding out who they were, because Aunt Nancy would think it was a friend of Uncle Waldorf's, Uncle Waldorf would think it's a friend of Aunt Nancy's, or it might be one of the children.
Joyce's life in the 1920s was typical for a girl of good social breeding. She learned music, went to parties, and appropriately became a debutante and was presented at court. But some years earlier, Joyce and her parents had become Christian Scientists through the encouragement of her aunt, Nancy Astor. From that moment on, her life and her lifestyle would be tempered by a devout commitment to her faith. Christian Science was one of the two foundations on which Joyce built her adult life. The other was Reggie Grenfel, the man she married at the early age of 19. Tall, quietly successful, and good-looking in an old-fashioned way, Reggie was to be Joyce's rock for the rest of her life.
This is our red letter day, it's come at last, you see. Couldn't really be a better day, it's meant for you and me, this day.
But the day Joyce and Reggie married was tinged with sadness.
She married very young to Reggie. She was 19, and her parents had decided to stay together until she left home. And she came back from a skiing holiday 3 months after she got married, and her mother had bolted. And she had had no idea that her mother had actually been having affairs left, right and centre for years, but her parents had decided to keep up a good front for their two children. And so it was a complete blow. And she never really got over that shock. And I don't think her father did either. He, too, was a very strong Christian Scientist. And he was a bit of a sort of Eeyore character, whereas her mother was the most amazing, lively, funny. She was the sort of woman who walked into a room and everybody felt better. And she would sing songs and tell jokes and mimic. But the moment she walked out of the room, she'd completely forgotten everybody in it. So she wasn't a particularly faithful friend, wife or mother. And she did come to rely on Joyce enormously. Joyce was constantly paying off her debts.
So with a financially irresponsible mother and a smart new house in Chelsea, acquired nonetheless through the generosity of her mother and Aunt Nancy Astor, Joyce set about earning her own living.
She'd started writing to the BBC several years before, asking for auditions. And in those days, anybody could write to them and they would get an audition. And she had several auditions, and there are the reports from the producers saying, very pretty voice, might be used for one day. Forgot about her. A year later, she'd turn up again. Same guy auditions her, completely forgotten her. Similar comments.
But Joyce's fortunes were about to change. Early in 1939, she was invited to a supper party by the BBC radio producer Stephen Potter. At the end of the evening, the guests were invited to perform a party piece, and Joyce chose to mimic a Women's Institute chairwoman. Among the guests there was the theatre producer Herbert Farjan, and unbeknown to Joyce, her innocent impersonation was about to change the course of her life forever.
Well, let's get down to business, shall we? Mrs. Hailstone, dear, would you be so kind as to turn off your TV? Thank you, that's a bit better. Well, it's very nice of you to let us meet here in your front room. I think we're all assembled. Mrs. Brill, Miss Pell, Mrs. Coulch, Mrs. Hailstone, May...
Joyce quickly demonstrated a talent for monologue. It was a talent which owed much to a friend of the family, the great American one-woman performer Ruth Draper, who stayed with them when she came to London. The theatre monologue was an easy act to programme in the light-hearted revues that were popular in the years before the Second World War. So when the producer Herbert Farjan watched Joyce performing her Women's Institute sketch at Stephen Potter's party, he knew how useful she could be to his forthcoming show, The Little Review. But Joyce had no previous experience in the theatre and had never really considered herself anything more than a natural amateur performer. The thought of joining a professional company was daunting, though she needn't have worried. When it came to monologue and song, Joyce was a natural.
3 lady choristers, members of the Royal Harmonic Society, singing eagerly with piety, all the oratorio.
In Joyful Noise, after she's done a little joke about the ladies' conveniences not being quite up to scratch at the Albert Hall, and then she looks away and she does very slow. It's wonderful, and they're so economic. When she does the fortissimo, and then P, 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 and after the last P she go little blink, and it's just so precise.
And sometimes but we are at our happiest when we have a call to come and sing like anything, as long as it's oratorio.
She's portraying an amateur, which is even harder. To be a sort of quasi-amateur who's actually a professional portraying a real amateur is an astounding
there's an example of really how skillful that is when she does the oratorio section, where she's just doing the passage. She does a covered voice, which is very oratorio, and she's so confident with her musicality that she can do the comedy of losing her place in the music across the beat. And so she's staying with the band and she's looking around and she's doing, and then she's on, and it's, you watch it and it's so skillful. What I think it is, that physical stuff, interestingly, when you think of a joke or you write a song, you can say it out loud or you can sing it to yourself and decide whether you think it's funny. But with physical comedy, you can't, because you can't see it. You can't look in a mirror and see yourself doing an aside. The only mirror that tells you whether it's funny or working is the audience.
Laughter.
And
that's only by the second night, isn't it?
But you can see in her performance, it's the product of second night after second night after second night. It's years of experience, and it's a joy to watch.
We are not very musical, but we are very keen. We practice every Thursday night, quite close to Golders Green. And some of us cannot sing much, and some can't sing at all. But we love things to
By now, war had been declared, and Joyce was suddenly faced with the prospect of temporary parenthood. 2 girls from the Godolphin and Latimer School in West London were billeted with Joyce and Reggie on the Cliveden estate in Buckinghamshire. Joyce and Reggie never had children. Yet suddenly she was faced with an instant family and a new career.
Hey, what's going on in here?
Coincidentally, Joyce's first feature film concerned two small children who were evacuated to New York at the outbreak of war. Joyce played their American foster mother.
Will you please read Mummy's letter, Mrs. Rogers?
This propaganda short was made at the height of the war in 1941 and was directed by the great Carol Reed.
I hope you're both well and being very good for Mrs. Rogers. Ethel sends her love and a big hug each. Good night, my darlings, and all my love.
This is London. The government have given instructions for the following important announcements. Closing of places of entertainment. All cinemas, theatres, and other places of entertainment are to be closed immediately until further notice.
Some theatres did reopen, but for matinee performances only. Joyce, the surrogate mother, commuted daily between her cottage on the Cliveden estate, where she and Reggie had moved in 1935, and the escapist West End revues, in which she continued to feature. She was also beginning to establish herself as a regular contributor to radio. And as if this wasn't enough, Joyce also found time to help Myra Hess with her hugely popular lunchtime concerts at the National Gallery. As General Dogsbody, she made the sandwiches and served tea to the hundreds of music lovers who queued patiently in Trafalgar Square. In 1942, with 2 revues to her credit already, Joyce joined the cast of another Herbert Farjan production called Light and Shade. It had opened to poor reviews, and Farjan hoped that Joyce's arrival would revive his show's fortunes. But the cast of seasoned actors were less than enthusiastic about the arrival of this newcomer.
The show had to be started by Betty Ann Davies, who was a very clever little comedian, and myself, doing, I cannot remember what it was, but it was some number where we were discovered on the stage at the very beginning. And so we had to get down to the stage and be prepared and in the mood for when the curtain went up, because curtains went up in those days, nearly always now it's lights going up. On the stage comes Joyce in her very most sort of bossy mood. Oh, I really must see who's in front. Peeps through the curtain as if she was doing the local fete or something, and says, I love to know who's in front, don't you? Betty Ann, no, I don't. Amateur.
When Light and Shade closed in 1942, women of Joyce's age were faced with the prospect of call-up to support the war effort. As a Christian Scientist, she wouldn't work in a munitions factory, so it was fortunate that she received a call from ENSA, the wartime department set up to provide entertainment to the Allied forces.
Oh, Mummy, you don't understand. I've been thinking an awful lot about you and Daddy lately, now that you're both so old. Well, you're 40.
Through the encouragement of Noel Coward, Joyce found herself in the midst of the North African campaign, and it was here, performing to jaded and generally unsympathetic soldiers, that she learned how to win over an audience. Her loyal and equally hard-working accompanist was Viola Tunnard.
And they set off in a boat, all terribly secret, to Algiers, and they worked their way across North Africa, performing 3 times a day to anything from 2 wounded soldiers to 400 soldiers going off to battle the next day. She would walk into a ward, she would start to sing, and everybody cheered up. And after she'd performed half an hour of songs in a ward, she would go around and talk to every man. And she would write letters for them. If they couldn't, if they were blind or they lost their hands, they would dictate them to them. Well, how many performers will do that?
At the end of the war, Joyce returned to London, to the theatre, and to the medium which had established her reputation up and down the country, radio. In fact, through her numerous and varied features for the BBC, Joyce became one of the most popular radio performers in the country.
Well, I couldn't do without me wireless. No, that'd never do. Well, I keep it on for the company as much as anything. Well, I don't listen to it all the time, but it's nice to hear it going on. You get used to it. I like the children's hour. Well, I like anything, really. I'm not fussy. But I don't like too much talking. I can't get on with what I'm doing if there's too much talking. Can't make out what they're talking about half the time. Just do it to hear themselves speak, I think.
Noel Coward, who had encouraged Joyce to join ENSA, now invited her to join the cast of his revue, Sigh No More. She contributed monologues to the show, but only one song survived rehearsals. It was a classic Joyce Grenfel number called Oh, Mr. Du Maurier.
Mr. Du Maurier, perhaps I'm out of date. Time flies when one isn't counting at a fearfully cheerful rate. The years must have gone on mounting, for now I estimate that I'm 70 years. Poor Du Maurier, what a Fourier, too late.
Oh, Mr. Du Maurier was one of the dozens of songs Joyce wrote in a 20-year collaboration with the composer Richard Addinsell. It's sometimes forgotten that Joyce wrote virtually every word of her own songs and the many monologues she performed.
Technically, and by the sort of careful cast calibrations of her period, she was the poshest comedienne or comedienne we've ever had. I mean, she actually was genuinely blue-blooded, particularly on the American side. And I think that in an era where a lot of her contemporaries, Hermione Gingold or B. Lilly or Anna Russell, whomever, had kind of married posh, she was the real thing. And I think not only did that mean that her constituency of an audience which tends to get overlooked, the posh audience, recognised and chimed with it, but also that she imparted a truth to her poshness, which the wider audience recognised. It wasn't a sort of music hall end of the pier posh, it was the real thing. And at a time when the upper classes were losing their power. It was, I mean, the music hall people portrayed posh as swaggeringly confident. In fact, in the 40s, 50s, the posh were losing their empire, losing their land, losing their servants. They'd killed all their sons in the wars. It was a bad time. And so there was an insecurity about the upper classes, which she picked on. She pulls out that sense of the rug slipping from underneath their feet with the goofy smile and the sort of the helplessly the automatic manners and those sorts of things, the sort of ritual and the formalities under which you sense something is slipping away, which is intensely funny and actually quite poignant as well.
By now, revue was in its twilight years, but Tuppence Coloured, starring Joyce and Daphne Oxenford, could still tour the country and enjoy a successful London run lasting nearly 12 months in 1947.
A lot of people say she was just a very, very gifted amateur. And I think in those days she was. She knew her own worth, but she was amateur. If anything funny happened, you know, it was almost a dig in the ribs. Join me in laughter. But she was very generous and really lovely to know. And I think after the first night in Brighton, they all went back to the hotel and thought, this is disaster. And so they needed someone like Joyce to say, no, it isn't. We will do this and this and this, and it will be all right. And, of course, she had her great faith that everything would always be all right. And somehow it was for her.
While audiences for the theatrical revue were starting to decline by the 1950s, Joyce was beginning to establish a reputation in the cinema, where a succession of mostly comic roles introduced her to a new generation of admirers.
Include Ode to an Expiring Frog, some lines written by myself. Can I view thee panting, lying on thy stomach without sighing? Can I, unmoved, see thee dying on a log, expiring frog? Shh! Say, have fiends in shape of boys with wild halloo and brutal
The
noise.
edges of comedy were pushed out with Joyce. it was always slightly verging on the teetering on the edge of, you know, turning into parody. She never quite did, or maybe she did on some of the early work. And I think I found that very attractive, that you could physically recreate somebody's walk and talk, almost as if you were taking off a teacher, you know. I think I found that a good thought. And I went much more in that direction than, you know, in the direction that some actresses, would-be actresses, might want to be Peggy Ashcroft. You know, we didn't often see Peggy Ashcroft in Hull, but we did see St Trinian's, and we did see Joyce a bit on the television.
Joyce's career was soaring. Through her early television shows, her popularity increased still further. But it was in the nature of her generous character that she still found time to help those of us like me, whose professional lives were just beginning. I met her when I was about 15. I was on a radio programme for teenagers, which was performed by teenagers, and the audience was teenagers. And we were reviewing the Bells of St Trinian's, and I'd never seen her before, and I thought she was wonderful, wonderfully funny in it, and very appealing. And I asked if I could interview her, because we had a segment called Top of the Ladder, and I wanted to do my own one-woman show, age 15. And they said yes, so they set up the interview at the St Martin's Theatre, because Joyce was doing Joyce Grenfel Requests the Pleasure then. And off I went with the producer and a microphone, which Joyce immediately took out of my hand for the interview. I was saying, Miss Grenfel, and she said, yes. So it looked like she was interviewing me, and there was a photo in the Radio Times with her holding the microphone. It was a good interview, although I was very nervous. I'd never seen anybody who looked like her before, because I'm quite little, and she was seemingly 6'5", she looked that day, with her hair long, stage makeup, and this huge personality. And I was really taken aback from the screen persona to the dressing room persona. But anyway, she was very sweet, and I did ask her the right questions, and she asked me quite a lot of questions and said, why did you choose, you know, what do you want to do then? Why did you choose this? And I said, well, I want to be like you. I'd like to have my own show, and I do characters. And she said, well, do somebody. So I did, and she said, oh, well, you're funny, aren't you? And I said, well, thank you. And we just kept in touch. And she encouraged me to write. I'd only done a very little bit of writing then. And she said, you must practice and you must send it to me. So I used to send her short stories, and she cut all the adjectives. Too much use of adjectives. And she really was instrumental in making me a writer, making me stick to it.
Hello, Miss Davidson. How frightfully nice to see you. Yes, that's right. Lumpy Latimer. Do you know, I'd entirely forgotten about that. Only Patsy Marsh is here, and she reminded me. Well, my name is now Clinch, as in boxing. I always say that. I married a man called Keith Clinch, and we've been living out in Kenya. You have to call it Kenya now. And we're more or less settled here now. The children have come, and that, yes. Yes, I think we are going to miss the sun, quite frightfully. I'm going to buy myself a woolly vest.
Joyce's understanding of the business she was in and the commercial value she could place on her work brought out another side of her character that was not generally recognised. Joyce, the businesswoman.
She was canny with money. I know she was a high earner on radio. I think probably the highest. You know, when people were getting 15 guineas, I think she was getting 75 or something like that, and doing very well and investing it wisely, and she was aware of money.
Some of the men she worked with, like Gilbert Harding, would have been furious if they'd known that she was being paid more than them. But I found evidence of the contracts in the BBC archives with little memos saying, we'll pay this woman this once, but don't let it get out. So she believed very strongly that women were worth as much as men.
The character of Police Sergeant Ruby Gates, which Joyce played in the first 3 St Trinian's films, would be the most famous and popular of all her film roles. Yet it was not a part she particularly warmed to.
Before you joined the police, you taught in a girls' school.
Yes, I was a games mistress.
Quite. And that's the reason I've chosen you for this job. I want you to go into a girls' school, incognito, of course, and see what's going on there.
It's not St. Trinian's.
St. Trinian's.
No, Sammy. No. You, of all people, to send me there. There are limits. I won't do it.
I shall regard a refusal as a dereliction of duty.
I can't help it. It's not fair. You're taking advantage of me.
Don't be ridiculous.
Yes, you are. After all we've meant to each other, it's wrong.
She was deeply embarrassed by St. Trinian's, which she saw as light and fluffy and generally silly. And she was asked to be in the last, I think there were 2 more St. Trinian's, and she just said, no, thank you, I've grown out of that. To start with, I think she was just in films because she was flattered to be asked. She was sent hundreds of scripts that she didn't want to be in because she said, you know, this isn't serious, or it's too serious, or it's atheist, or... You know, she was quite strict on what she'd be in.
Joyce was also quite strict about allowing others to share her work with her. One of the people she introduced me to was Pat Dixon, who produced The Goons. And I went to see him, and he said, well, we don't have any lady goons, but, you know, if I did get a programme where we wanted a comedy young person, I'd come to you, because I auditioned for him. He said, listen, I tell you what, I'm doing a radio, I think it was series of 3 with Joyce. He said, why don't you give her a ring and ask her if you could be in it? Because then you could do your little slot, or maybe you could do a sketch with her, and, you know, be a nice break for you. So I thought, oh, what a wonderful idea. So I wrote to her and said, Pat Dixon said, and please, 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 I wrote about 53 pleases. Could I? It would be absolutely wonderful. And there was no letter, and there was silence. And then one early evening, there was a phone call. And she said, I'm telephoning you. I tried to write a letter, but it's rather bald. How dare you? And I said, what? How dare you say, could you be in a show with me? And I said, well, why? What's wrong? You know, Pat Dixon said, how dare he? What do you mean? And it was the only time I've heard her angry. And she really lost it, as they say. I still don't know why, to that extent. But I said, you know, I'm going to leave school. I was still at school. I'm going to leave school soon. It would be such a lovely break for me. It would. She said, well, if you want to do it that much, go and act on the end of the pier. So I got off the phone in tears and went upstairs and told my mother. And she said, look, maybe she's right. Maybe it was very, very cheeky of him to say it and of you to say it to her. We don't know what she thought, but don't lose her. She's a wonderful friend, and she's been marvellous to you. And I think you should write and say you overstepped the mark and you're sorry, which I did, and then everything was fine, and it was never mentioned again. But it sort of went... And it still makes me uncomfortable to think about it. And I'm not quite sure what I did wrong. By the mid-1950s, Joyce's reputation had spread abroad. Her London revue, Joyce Grenfel Requests the Pleasure, had been a huge commercial success, and the show transferred to Broadway. American audiences loved her typically English brand of humour, and she quickly attracted the attention of America's premier television host, Ed Sullivan.
Now, the other night when I first saw Joyce Grenfel on our stage here in New York, I walked into the theater. I knew I was going to see an intimate review with songs, dances, and sketches, but I wasn't quite prepared for the entrance that she made, because she, of course, was talking to a live audience, just as you in our theater are tonight. So, ladies and gentlemen, here is the brilliant English comedian, Joyce Grenfel, just as she appears in her theater, the Bijou.
Very nice of you to come. Do you know each other, Mrs.
What is extraordinary about Joyce's first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show is the way she treats a television audience of many millions in exactly the same way she would a tiny audience in one of her theatres, without any nervousness.
Well, it's so exhausting just existing, isn't it? What's it all about, one longs to know. It's one long rush.
After one of the Ed Sullivan shows, Joyce met the young Elvis Presley, making an early appearance on American television. In a clash of cultures, Joyce remarked that Presley was pleasant in a roly-poly sort of way. He put his arm round my neck and breathed down my ear hole. Joyce now had an international reputation, and her peculiarly English humour found an appreciative audience in Australia. Among her ardent fans was a young undergraduate, Clive James.
First of all, the whole Australian theatre-going class was steeped in English traditions. I mean, they'd be seeing people like Googie Withers and John McCallum on stage, Laurence Olivier touring and everything. There's a high value was placed on the English heritage, and there's quite a lot of knowledge about it, and indeed sort of distant nostalgia for it. I mean distant in the sense of far-flung, in the way you feel things more intensely when you're 12,000 miles away. She had all that going for her. But she was a natural Democrat anyway. I mean, if ever anyone had the common touch, it was Joyce. She just wasn't common about the way she did it. You always knew she was a lady, but she could put anyone at their ease. She was popular with her drivers. That's always a good sign.
Cheryl, I had a coloured picture postcard from that foreign fella I met at Easter. Remember? I told you. Well, you know my boy Norm? You know, the one that drives the lorry with the big ears? Well, he was a bit funny about me knowing this Heinrich. But I said to him, look, I said, you've got to have hands across the water nowadays. So he says, mind you don't fall in.
So carefully did Joyce prepare her shows that she was not beyond chastising her audience if they interfered with the performance.
One night in Sydney, she told the audience to stop eating sweets. It was a famous occasion because the Australians cultivated it as they were, and they understood perfectly what she was up to. They appreciated it. That's what they were there for. That's why they bought the ticket. They had not learned to be silent during the performance, and they liked eating sweets. So everyone bought a box of Winning Post chocolates to share, you know. Every couple had a box of Winning Post chocolates. Winning Post, that was the brand. It was a green box. You take off the top, and there was a choice of chocolates, and each chocolate was wrapped in an individual piece of crinkly paper. So when the lights went down at the start of the second half, everyone had bought their chocolates during the interval. There was this quiet storm of crackling. It was as if locusts were attacking your television aerial. It was an extraordinary noise, and Joyce stopped. She put up with it for a few nights, and about the sixth night, I think, of the run, she stopped and said, look, you really have to stop doing that. It's very, very good of you to be here, but if you want to hear what I have to say, you've got to make slightly less noise, or I'll just be here moving my mouth, or something like that. Anyway, there was a tremendous silence in the auditorium, and then there was this collective sigh, the sound that the top of the box makes when it goes back on the box. And the top of the chocolate box went back on the chocolate box all over the house, and that was the end of it. And for the rest of the run, she was never bothered again. But that was, she seized her moment. And the reason she did it was she did not like anything extraneous to happen to this careful thing she'd orchestrated.
Joyce wrote nearly all her monologues after the Second World War, and her characters would become classics for generations to come.
Such peaceful thoughts my mind doth fill, serene my heart today, and sweet and calm all, and doubt is fled away. Unclouded is the view I see, and undisturbed. I've just remembered something absolutely ghastly. I forgot to go into the kitchen before we came to church to turn the gas off underneath the chicken bones I am turning into soup. I know exactly what's going to happen. All the water will boil away, and the bottom of the saucepan will get red hot and fall on the floor of the kitchen, and very slowly the linoleum will burn through and set fire to the house. And my fur coat isn't insured. And where are we going to sleep tonight? No troubled thoughts confuse me. Harmonious is the way. I suppose suppose if I were to make a dash for it, I might be able to rescue the drawing that is supposed to be by Picasso. But I would far rather have my old photograph books and my cosy bedroom slippers. Darling, I don't suppose that you went into the kitchen and turned the gas off underneath the soup. No, I was afraid you wouldn't have done. Excuse me,
Joyce's television recordings would influence a whole generation of female performers, like Dilly Keane.
Well, when I went into the theatre, which I suppose is, 30 years ago, my mother thought I was going to hell in a handcart. She thought I was going to, end up on the streets. I'm now in the Lyric Theatre, and outside there are girls plying their trade in doorways. I think that's what my mother thought I was going to be doing. And she was horrified and tried to stop me. And, they wouldn't pay for me to go to drama school or anything like that. So, yes, of course, it's got much easier. And I would point to Joyce Grenfel and say, but she's from a frightfully grand family. Yes, well, that's all very well, darling. But she had connections, and we have no connections in the theatre.
In spite of differences in their backgrounds, Joyce and Dilly Keane do have things in common.
We shared the fact that neither of us had children, so I suppose they become a kind of family. So I haven't had that sort of, huge drain on my time that I have to sort of rush back and look after somebody who's doing their GCSEs or something. So therefore, you can look after the people who've given you a livelihood.
The failure to have children was the one enduring sadness in Joyce's life, although if she had been a mother, we might not have had Joyce the entertainer. But even without children, Joyce could still perform the role of mother.
You should have seen her running a kids' party. There was nothing like it. There was a whole bunch of kids, and I was just a guest at the time. And these were kids, little ones. One of them was Luciana Arrighi, who later became famous theatre designer. She was gorgeous. I read a poem about her, actually, which Joyce told me wasn't good enough. They were diving around, and Joyce was running it, and you could see the mother she would have been.
Her ability to observe the way adults relate to children found expression in her most famous monologue of all.
Now then, everybody listen carefully. Once upon a time, there was a dear little bunny rabbit, and he lived... Where did he live? No, not in a flat. Not in a tree. And not in a television set. Now think. Yes, Hazel, he did. He lived in a hole. Only some of us like to call it a burrow, don't we? And he lived in the burrow. Who did he live there with, Caroline? With his mummy bunny rabbit. Good. And who else? His daddy bunny rabbit. Right. And who else? All his little brother and sister bunny rabbits. Wasn't that nice? Yes, it was, Sydney. No, he wasn't a burglar bunny rabbit. No, nor was his daddy. Well, he was just an ordinary businessman. David, dear, don't wander away like that. I know the window is there, but you don't want to look out of it. Our story's getting much too exciting. Now, you come along, and you sit down next to Neville. Neville, move up a little, and Neville, don't pull your jersey down like that over your knees. Well, you see, you get it all out of shape, and Mummy won't be a bit pleased. Lavinia, don't pull your jersey. Children, I don't want you all.
She was an interesting mixture of shy and gregarious, which I think is always interesting. But she had the brilliant ability, Bennett-like ability, to make you think that she was telling you everything. And people like that. It makes them feel like a friend. I think she genuinely liked people, and she genuinely enjoyed performing. I mean, I do believe she couldn't wait to get on. It's the same thing that people feel in Judi Dench. Oh, you feel she can't wait to bounce on the stage. Whereas actually most actors have a very mixed feeling about performing. They want to do it, but they're not sure if they want all the stuff that goes with it, and they'd much rather sit in front of the telly with a box of chocolates most nights.
I'm a picture postcard that your Uncle Willie
As Britain shook off the last vestiges of post-war austerity, it might have marked the decline of Joyce Grenfel's popularity. The twin forces of television and satirical stage shows like Beyond the Fringe were killing off the innocuous and by now old-fashioned revue. And what Joyce represented was light years away from the mood in Britain's swinging 60s. The loud music, the miniskirts and the cult of youth were anathema to her. And yet with her brilliant and loyal accompanist Bill Blezard, she continued to appeal to audiences not only on stage and film, but on television too. But whenever possible, only on the BBC. She was mildly disapproving of commercial television in Britain, although it hadn't deterred her from appearing on Ed Sullivan's show for commercial television in America. She wouldn't do commercials. She didn't approve of ITV at the beginning, and she told me not to work for them. And I wrote to her and said, I hope you don't mind, but I've taken a job with Associated Rediffusion. And she wrote back and said, what do you mean, do I mind? You know, you have to. As if she'd never said it. But no, she didn't want to work for them. Joyce enjoyed her biggest television audiences in Britain as a regular contributor to the popular BBC quiz programme Face the Music. It was very much a team effort, and its success depended entirely on the chemistry between the regular panellists.
Good evening, and I hope you're ready to face the music and join our Easter Monday parade with Joyce Grenfel.
Good evening.
Richard Baker.
Happy Easter.
And Robin Ray.
Good evening.
We used to relax quite often with a kind of a drink. There was a lighting rehearsal at about 6 o'clock in the evening. We had to be very careful that we didn't get any hint of what the questions were going to be or anything of that sort. So it was just a lighting rehearsal. And after that, there was rather a gap before the audience arrived for the actual recording. A gap filled with something that doesn't happen in the BBC like it did, called hospitality. And there was quite a lot of it, and some of us enjoyed it perhaps just a fraction too much. I remember Joyce turning to me. She had this slightly nannyish manner. All for our good, mind you, which is intended in the kindest possible way. And she turned to me on this occasion and said, now, Dickie, one more gin and tonic, and there'll be tears before bedtime. I rather fancy she was absolutely right.
And was it the Spring Symphony?
No.
This great voice keeps coming in.
Not you again, was it?
No,
Wasn't the music like
it wasn't the Spring Symphony.
No, but it was...
It
was Britain again, wasn't it?
It was Britain,
yes.
right, but not the Spring Symphony.
He's going to have half your fee if you go on like this.
Yes, do come again.
Yes, I will, yes.
Do you know, she did rather appear to be a head girl. That's quite right. She was... it was all, as I say, extremely well meant, and she didn't mean to kind of patronise us, but I think she regarded the rest of us, and the people like David Attenborough and Bernard Levin and all sorts of really quite respectable people, she regarded as slightly irresponsible and in need of care and attention. She was going to deliver it if nobody else did. And of course, one had to remember that she did have a very aristocratic background as the niece of Lady Astor and all that. And that came out in one or two little tiny ways. We used to stay in Manchester at the Midland Hotel, the old railway hotel, which was very elegant, perhaps a bit old-fashioned. And one day, Robin Ray said, I don't know why we don't go and stay at the Piccadilly Hotel, which was in those days quite new. It's, you know, very attractive and all the rest of it. And Joyce said, oh, no, I have to stay at the Midland. They still have linen sheets.
Sometimes the questions became so complicated that even the chairman, Joseph Cooper, was baffled.
Now, Robin, what initials has that given you?
4.
4?
For a start. Well, W. Do you want the whole answer now?
Well, you might as well just tell us.
The composer is Weinberger, so I get W.
Yes.
And Joyce made a joke earlier on about, funnily enough, pure coincidence about this piece. It's called Schwander the Bagpiper. Schwander the Bagpiper by Weinberger. Lovely to say, which gives me 4 initials, but you can't want all Schwander the Bagpiper, so perhaps you want Overture? O?
I would like a P.
Poem. Would you?
Piper.
No.
Polka.
Always polka.
Polka. Oh, I see. Oh, yes.
That's
a relief to everybody.
Slightly wrong. We take the initial of the piece played as well as the initial of the composer.
Yes, I see. Well, you can have both, you see.
Yes.
And if I were you, for this one, I should go for P, S, and W.
Right.
Right.
Gosh.
Oh, dear. Mary Lloyd.
Delayed action. Right, PSW. I can't wait for the next one.
Joyce's sense of propriety was matched by a keen sense of competitiveness towards her fellow panellists.
Well, the questions are played to their strengths, and to that extent, we had these questions that suited people, in a way, suited their area of interest. And this was a question which was to do with, I'm going to play you one phrase, said Joseph Cooper, and can you complete it? And Joyce had a nice little voice. And so he played one note on the piano, T, and of course he was going to go on to T-ya-da-dum, ba-da-dee-da-da-dum, ba-da. And he played the one note, T. I know it, Joe, she said. I know it. It's La Jeune Fille, which is the Debussy prelude. And not only she did know it, but she said, Joe, it feels like I've won Wimbledon. And not only won Wimbledon, but won it with an ace, she said.
In 1973, Joyce lost an eye to the illness that would turn out to be cancer. She kept her partial blindness from everyone except her nearest and dearest, and the damaged eye was replaced by an artificial one. Yet while the pain increased over the next few years, she never mentioned it to anyone. Irrepressible and absolutely determined to carry on as normal, Joyce appeared on The Michael Parkinson Show in 1976.
I had done this thing of making the audience close their eyes, and because I say that radio is the most imaginative of all the media, I make them look at and see me. I'm an enormous lady, you know, with a face like an expression, what do I say, a face like a reflection in a spoon, I once said. I've kept it in. And I say, shut your eyes and I will try and make you see another shape. And it's really rather heavenly. I've seen a lot of these young students sit there, you know, and they listen and you see them going when they recognise. And, of course, they're doing all the work.
Shall we try it with the audience?
Well, yes, shall we? I wonder if they will. Shut your eyes and I'll try and make you think that I'm another shape. Now, you know what shape I am, but all right, now shut your eyes and don't cheat.
I would like to think that you would think that I was a little old lady in a cottage somewhere in Buckinghamshire, and I've got a little old pussy cat, and I keep oh, he's a lovely little old cat. Yeah, but you know, he has to go out a lot now. Yes, every few minutes, really. Oh, yes. No, don't scratch, dear. You know, it's first coming out.
Joyce was still recording a series of Face the Music every year, but by now she had shared her increasing blindness with the programme's producers.
But I do remember at the time when she first was unwell and first had this difficulty with her eye, that she invited Walter Todds, the producer of the show, and me, and we had a foursome. It was delightful. I remember a very civilised lunch we had in her Elm Park Gardens flat, and it was all very delicately and beautifully produced. I was terribly nervous, actually, but she never let people be nervous for too long. And what she really wanted was assurance that she could go on. And it mattered to her that she could go on, because Face the Music, I believe, really did matter. It was her last link, in a way, and it wasn't a too demanding a link with an audience that she wanted to keep in touch with. And it was a big audience. It ran to 5 or 6 million from time to time, and it kept her in touch with the whole of those people who perhaps are now remembering her with enjoyment and pleasure. And as she did that, I think that she really worried, of course, that her time was up. But it wasn't. She consulted us in 1974. And by that time, I think the early first diagnosis was there of the difficulties which she had to face. But she went on to 1979.
Joyce died on November the 27th. Until the very end, she was unaware of the exact nature of her illness and had refused to see a doctor until Reggie insisted on it.
The doctors realised that there was actually nothing they could do, and Reggie asked some of her friends, shall I tell her? And the Christian Scientist friends said, well, there isn't really any point because she doesn't believe in the body and disease. It's not anything of interest to her. So she was never told that she'd got cancer. But the day after their 50th golden wedding party, the very next day she took to her bed and she died about 2 weeks later. But she had a happy time in that 7-8 years without medical treatment, which would have destroyed her.
Barely a fortnight earlier, she had received a letter from Downing Street telling her she was to be appointed Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire. Sadly, she died before it was conferred. So why was Joyce so popular in her lifetime? And why is she still remembered with such affection over a quarter of a century after her death?
No one has the versatility that Joyce had. She could sing, play the piano, write sketches, poems, letters. She did delightful watercolours. I mean, you name it, she can do it.
She was so refined and upmarket, and yet she was distributing all this largesse. She was Lady Bountiful. And she did convey this sense that there was such a thing as a civilization, maybe a vanished civilization, that worked in all its levels, because she was interested in all those levels. She was as interested in the village postman or the person who kept the village sweet shop as she was in the squire in the hall. You go out walking with her and she'd be interested in everything. Interested in the policemen. The first police women were showing up. She was very interested in that. She would watch the garbage collector and see how he did it. She'd file it all away in her head. There was a very democratic approach. It's the charming democratic instinct of the person who is truly at ease in their position in society.
She was a consummate professional. There are not many women producing their own shows in those days. And the worst you can ever hear about Joyce is she didn't suffer fools gladly. Well, good for her, because as a woman in this business, you can't.
I don't think she got the credit for her extraordinary hard work, talent and creativity that she deserved. If you look at her monologues, each one lasts no more than 6 minutes. That's her longest. And the shortest, most of them are 2 or 3 minutes. And each one is a slice of a person's life with a fantastically well-constructed story around it. And she would evolve them, sometimes over years, the character and the story, till she got her monologues so that she could walk onto the stage as if she just walked out of the kitchen onto the stage and, oh, how lovely, all my friends have come to see me. I'm just going to tell you a story I thought of just now. And that's how it came over. And that's why people think it was so easy. But she actually worked incredibly hard to get that feeling of impromptu.
Joyce Grenfel paved the way for some of Britain's most popular comediennes, like Victoria Wood and Catherine Tate. And yet, there was something unique about Joyce that made her act an impossible one to follow. She loved performing, and equally she loved the people she was performing to, and they took her to their hearts because of her warmth and her sincerity. Joyce was part of the family, and over a quarter of a century after her death, her refreshing presence is as welcome today as it ever was.
So stately as a galleon, I sail across the floor, doing the military two-step as in the days of yore. I dance with Mrs. Tiverton, she's light on her feet in spite of turning the scale of 14 stone and being of medium height. So gay the band, so giddy the sight, full evening dresses are must, but the zest goes out of a beautiful mood when you dance it bust to bust.